everyone, welcome back to the course Introduction to Infrastructure Asset Management. This course is offered under MOOCs, an initiative of Government of India. In the last lecture, we continued our discussion on this management process where we talked about development of alternatives. We saw what are different alternatives as far as infrastructure asset management is concerned. We talked about different maintenance techniques and the need to develop an effective maintenance plan. Now, before we move on to decision making, it is important to discuss some parameters around budget. This particular lecture, the focus will be on discussing budget, especially budget planning and budget programming. Once we have an understanding of the available budget, we basically move to the step of decision making. This lecture is the third lecture in this particular week where we are discussing budget planning and budget programming. Budget planning and budget programming are two important aspects of infrastructure asset management decision making. Let us understand what is the difference between these two terms. We will start our discussion with budget planning. Budget planning for infrastructure asset management. We have already seen this process where we have understood that this entire decision making process accounts for policies, goals and budget. Now, when it comes to budget planning, we need to first understand what are the relevant policies and what are the relevant goals. We use the information to conduct budget planning. What is budget planning? Budget planning is the process of estimating financial resources required to maintain, repair and replace the asset so that it meets organizational objectives. Here the goal is to estimate the minimum budget which is required to achieve and maintain the established infrastructure over a given condition for the planning horizon. Finally, we are actually conducting a detailed needs analysis to estimate how much money do we need. The process of budget planning aims to understand how much money is required to maintain my infrastructure in a condition which is as per the goals and policies of the organization. Now, the question is, how do we estimate budget planning? We need to determine the total amount of money required annually to maintain our assets. The process of budget planning looks something like this. It starts with understanding what is the inventory. We try to develop a catalog of assets so that we have a list of all the assets which are under our purview. We also identify the key characteristics of the assets. It could include the traffic on a road, the occupancy in a building, the environmental conditions under which the building is and so on. We also try to collect past data if there is any maintenance done in the past and we establish a baseline. Then we move to the next step, which is condition assessment and performance standards. Here we try to assess the current condition of all the assets and also we try to understand what is the acceptable condition for these assets. We make a record of that. Next, based on the information available, we try to establish what are the needs for this asset. We have the information on current condition as well as acceptable condition. We use this information to understand what are the maintenance requirements for the asset. We also review any asset management plan which is available. We use this information to finally estimate how much resources will be required to perform the maintenance. We determine both short term and long term resource requirements. We also try to account for the life cycle costs. Finally, at the end of budget planning, we should get a number that this much amount of money is required to maintain all your assets above the acceptable condition. I hope the process of budget planning is clear. Now, we will discuss each of these in detail. The first step is asset inventory. We want to prepare a catalog of all the assets. It could be an inventory of all the buildings, new buildings, old buildings, small buildings, high-rise buildings, and so on. It could be a list of all the bridges. It could be different sections of the bridges, and so on. It could also be all the roads in a network. So, your asset inventory is basically a list of all the assets under your purview. Then the next step is condition assessment. Here we have been talking about this, that an asset's performance decreases with time. Now say at a given time, here we are at time t is equals to 20 years. Now you want to assess what is the condition. You go to the site, collect relevant information and try to assess this particular point. This represents the current condition of the asset. Also, if the information about past performance is available, you try to collect that as well. So, you might have a performance curve which looks like this solid line here. Now, at year 20, obviously you will only know the performance at that time. Future performance needs to be estimated. Now, this is for one asset. You need to do this for all the assets. So, you can have multiple assets and you try to record performance for each of these assets. If you look closely, the first three graphs here, each of them have the age of infrastructure to be around 20 years. Now, if you compare 1, 2 and 3, you will see that the performance at the end of 20 years for each of these infrastructure is different. The infrastructure 1 has a performance of around 90, 2 at the same age has a performance of 80, 3 at the same age has a performance which is nearly 100, it is around 98 or 97. So, we record this information, that what is the age of the infrastructure and what is the condition. Also, you might have other assets which might be relatively new. You might have an infrastructure at age 10 which is as good as new. Alternatively, you might have an infrastructure at age 10 but it has deteriorated to almost performance of 90. All these are possible. These are just 5 assets. Your inventory can have multiple assets. For example, a city can have thousands of kilometers of road. You need to define the condition of each of those roads. Then you get an idea of what is the current condition. Based on the current condition, we move to the next step to understand what are the needs of the asset. Needs are nothing but the maintenance which is required. We have already talked about this, that an asset might require reactive maintenance or corrective maintenance. Alternatively, it might require preventive maintenance. Sometimes, based on the asset management plans, it might require a scheduled maintenance. You might say that as per the design of this particular infrastructure, it must be maintained every 10 years. No matter what the condition of the infrastructure is, I must do its maintenance. Sometimes you might have to do predictive maintenance. That is, you are saying, although the age of infrastructure is new, but it has deteriorated a lot and I need to do a maintenance early on. All these will define the asset's need. For example, if you compare these two assets, both of them have age around 10. Now, if you compare the performance of these two assets, you see that asset 1 is as good as new. On the other side, asset 2 has deteriorated a lot. Here, you also try to forecast what will be the future assets performance. So, the dotted line here or here represents forecasted performance. Now, you see that in case of the first asset, it has a life of around 30 years because the performance is not going below the critical level. This is the case where I am not doing any maintenance. On the other hand, for the second asset, if I do not do any maintenance, its life is nearly 15 years. After 15 years, the performance is going below the critical level. So, I hope the idea is clear that using an asset's information, its current condition, and by estimating or forecasting its future condition, we do needs assessment. Let us see another example. You might have two assets which are like this. The first one is of age 10, that is, it is 10 years old. Even the second one is 10 years old. You see that performance of both of these assets are more or less same. However, when you are estimating the future performance, it is different. If you follow closely here, the performance for this asset and this particular asset is different. Asset on the right hand side is likely to deteriorate at a slower rate compared to the first one. Now, this could be due to several reasons. It could be due to the usage patterns which are expected in the future. It could be due to the environmental conditions and so on. So, again, based on the current condition, the age of the infrastructure and the forecasted condition, you try to assess needs for a given infrastructure. Also, it is important to note that along with understanding the needs of the asset, we also need to understand what will be the expected result of doing an asset maintenance. That is, we are trying to estimate that if I do a maintenance at this point, what will be the result of this maintenance? Will the performance increase and then again go down? Or if I do maintenance here, will the performance not increase, but the deterioration will get slower, and so on. So, when doing needs assessment, we need to understand which asset requires maintenance and what will be the expected result of doing that maintenance. Once we process this information, we finally have an idea of what we want to do for this particular asset. It could mean we will do nothing, or we will do a daily or routine maintenance. Sometimes you could assess we will do preventive maintenance or light rehabilitation or heavy rehabilitation. Finally, during needs assessment, we finally estimate what type of maintenance is required, what are the resources required, and what is the expected performance of the asset if this particular maintenance is carried out. Also, we need to do this over years. We are not maintaining an asset only for a year. A given asset might be maintained for multiple years. During life of an asset, you might have multiple maintenance which are required. So, when doing needs assessment, you try to create a maintenance schedule. That is, for each asset, you try to estimate what type of maintenance it will need in year 1, what will it need in year 2, and so on till the life of an asset. You do this for all the assets under your purview. Based on the information about the maintenance requirements for all the assets, you try to estimate how much resources are required each year. Then you try to estimate how much money is required to perform all the maintenance activities planned in a given year. So, for every asset, I record the type of maintenance which is required. For the time being, let us assume all the empty cells means do nothing. Once I have this, for each year, I calculate the requirement for doing maintenance. So, I see that for year 1, I need to do a maintenance for asset 1, I might have to do a maintenance for asset 5, and so on. I calculate the total resources required in year 1. Then I estimate the total funds required in year 1. I hope this is clear that needs assessment or budget planning is not done for 1 year. We are doing a short term planning which is typically 4 to 5 years, or a long term planning which is generally 15 to 25 years. This is the process of budget planning. At the end, we have an estimate of total funds required each year and their purpose. Having discussed what is budget planning, now let us discuss what is budget programming. How is it different from budget planning? In budget planning, we saw that we were estimating the total amount of money required to maintain all our assets. Now, when we move to budget programming, the goal of budget programming is to allocate resources. Budget programming is also known as budget allocation. Here, we are trying to allocate resources. Budget programming deals with evaluating various allocation alternatives to basically optimize the overall infrastructure condition under a given budget. The important thing to note here is we do budget programming under a given budget. Here, in case of budget planning, we had estimated how much amount of money is required. Obviously, most often than not, you don't have all the money which is required. So, you move to the next step, which is budget programming, where if the allocated budget is less than what was estimated, we try to do budget programming. Emphasis on funds distribution. We try to determine how the funds which are available can be effectively utilized. Here, note that we are trying to evaluate various allocation alternatives. Let us briefly discuss what does this mean. For example, say I have 5 road sections which I need to maintain. Say I need to maintain them for 5 years. Now, for this particular road, 1, I might say that I will do preventive maintenance in year 1, not do anything for the next year, not do anything for the 3rd year, 4th year I again do a preventive maintenance, and then 5th year I do nothing. Alternative 2 for year 1 could look something like this. Year 1, I might decide to do nothing, again do nothing, again do nothing, again do nothing, and at year 5, I say I will do a light rehabilitation. Again, I could have many more options like this. Now, this particular strategy could be strategy 1. This strategy could be strategy 2. Obviously, each of these strategies will have their own associated costs. In the process of budget programming, we are trying to evaluate among all the alternatives which are available, what is the alternative which can optimize the overall infrastructure's condition and ensure that we don't overshoot our budget. So, in budget programming, for each asset, we are trying to understand what is the optimal asset management plan to ensure that the total budget doesn't exceed what is available with us. Budget programming is only required if the total amount of money available with us is less than what we had estimated during budget planning stage. Now, let us discuss what is the process for budget programming. Budget programming process starts with evaluating the available budget. You try to understand how much budget is available, the total funds which are available with us. We also try to understand what is the schedule of funds, how much money will be available each year or each month. We also try to understand if there are any restrictions on using these funds. Oftentimes, funds are allocated in different categories. So, you try to understand how much budget is available for each category. There could be categories like safety, quality, roadside assistance, and so on. Now, Once you have an understanding of the available budget, we move to assets evaluation. Here, we try to understand the current condition of the asset. We try to understand the asset's performance over time. This is important because in order to understand any trend, we must have information about assets performance over time. What I am trying to say here is, for any asset, say I go at year 10, either I might have a single point estimate, which is what is the current performance. Alternatively, I might have a better information about how the performance has been over the last 10 years. Here, this particular scenario where we only have a single point estimate, that is, no one else has recorded information in the last 10 years, or if it is recorded, it is not available to you at this moment. Then it becomes difficult to understand how the asset will perform over time. On the other hand, in this particular scenario, if we know how the asset has been performing over the last 10 years, it becomes relatively easier to predict how the asset will perform in the future. Within asset evaluation, we also try to understand the maintenance requirements. We also try to understand what are the M&R options available, what are the resources required to perform these, and the cost associated with them. Finally, we come to prioritization of assets. We do asset evaluations for a lot of assets. Finally, we prioritize assets. We see what is the current condition, how important is an asset, what is the risk of failure for an asset, and how critical is an asset. We try to do prioritization where, say, out of 100 assets, I might prioritize and only do maintenance for 20 assets in year 1. I might say that in year 2, I will do maintenance for 10 assets, and so on. So, this is the process of prioritization. Prioritization is a function of current condition, also a function of how important an asset is. Then, what is the chance of failure? What is the risk of failure? And how critical is an asset? We will talk about prioritization in detail in the next lecture. I hope for now the idea is clear that budget programming or budget allocation is basically evaluating different allocation alternatives to maximize overall infrastructure condition under the given budget. Here, at the end of budget programming, we are trying to answer 3 key questions. Question number 1 is, which project should receive an action? When I say action here, I mean maintenance. What action should be carried out? And finally, when should the action be taken? So, for every asset, we will have this information, what type of maintenance it requires and when does it require that. In summary, basically budget programming is helping us in understanding which projects require an action, what action should be taken and when should it be taken. Output of budget programming will be in the form of a maintenance plan and schedule. For each asset, you will have information about what type of maintenance should be done, at which year it should be done, and so on. There are different ways to perform budget programming. Budget programming basically is dealing with prioritization. We have to determine an appropriate prioritization method to understand out of the 100 assets we have, which 20 assets should be prioritized in year 1. This could be done using several methods. It could be based on subjective experience, it could be using a decision matrix, or it could be using a decision tree. Sometimes it could be using some optimization methods. We will talk about all these methods in detail in the next lecture. Also, it is important to note that some of these methods may or may not involve economic analysis. Sometimes you might make a decision purely based on the performance of the asset. Sometimes you might say that money is important and I should account for economic analysis in my decision making. We will discuss these aspects in detail in the next lecture. I hope the difference between budget planning and budget programming is clear. We have discussed the process for doing budget planning in this lecture. We also saw the process to do budget programming. In the next lecture, we will discuss different methods which are used for prioritization of assets. Now, students are encouraged to go over these references if you want to learn about this particular topic. Thank you. Thanks for listening.